And not only that, he was also published in the Journal of Physiotherapy and the Strength and Conditioning Journal. Without further ado, let us welcome Dr. Wynne. Dr. Wynne, the floor is yours and you have 20 minutes for your presentation.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you for the introduction and the organising committee, and I'm very passionate about ongoing learning and education, and the fact so many people are here today for that reason is inspiring. So thank you for listening. I'm going to talk about an area of personal and professional interest, which is endurance runners, and we're going to dive into the topic. So my clicker might not work. So a quick online media search of news articles in Indonesia will show that endurance running has a boom at the moment. There's an increase in participation, there's an increase in popularity, and a very brief overview of a search will show that, and I'm sure a lot of people here will attest and be participants in the fact that endurance running is expanding across Asia and across Indonesia. There we go. And so, the evidence suggests that, running is increasing in popularity in Indonesia and in Asia. And there's a few reasons for that, but a couple of studies will show that there's an increase in wearable technology use, and there's been a big increase in the last couple of years, which is a proxy measure for a lot of endurance sport athletes. We also see there's an increase in running club participation in a study from 2024. And there's a variety of influences and reasons for this increase in participation. Some of it is government-led initiatives, like the car-free streets in Jakarta, which I think is an excellent initiative that the government is doing. There's Gen Z priorities. There's, as was mentioned eloquently in the previous presentation, social media influences, which is having a big role and a big impact on the increase in, and the changing increase, but the increase in endurance sports and running in Indonesia. And before we dive into the topic, I just wanted to canvass two key points around the runner that I think is important for everyone listening today to understand. And the first one is that an endurance runner has high demands placed on them. And in particular, we see those high demands be external forces, which are measured in ground reaction force, and we see internal forces, which are typically referenced as muscle forces relative to body weight. And we see the endurance runner having these high muscle forces at jogging and sprinting speeds and really fast ground contact times, indicating high demands placed on the athlete. What we also see is a well-publicised high injury incidence rate for endurance runners. And in some studies, this is shown to be up to 90%, but clinically and in most of the research, this is somewhere between 30 to 79%, we will see. And most of these injuries are typically overload injuries, and the knee is in all literature and what I see clinically, the most common site of endurance running injuries. So I think that's just important to keep in mind. But for the purpose of the talk today, we're going to follow two runners. We're going to follow Bagus and we're going to follow Rizky. And for the purpose of the talk today, both of them are training for the Jakarta Running Festival on October 25th. And we'll come back to these runners and reference a couple of key considerations around preventing injury in relation to these two runners. And so the purpose of the talk today is around preventing running injury. But when we consider preventing injury, we first must answer this question. Are we preventing injury or are we looking to reduce risk? And the evidence suggests it's really hard to actually avoid injury, and that the term risk mitigation or managing injury risk should be more appropriate. And in endurance runners, we see that discontinuing training because of injury is one of the most common reasons that the runners will stop training. And this is particularly important because a study by Michael Drew in 2017 found that increased sport participation or completing more sessions increases the likelihood of athletic success. So the goal for us as coaches, as therapists, as physiotherapists and researchers should be to look at ways to maximize our athletes completing more participation, because this will have further reaching performance benefits. And so for the purpose of the talk, we're going to look at these 4 factors and we're going to relate them back to our endurance runner. We're going to talk about sleep, we're going to talk about training load, strength training and running biomechanics. And we're going to canvass a couple of evidence-based considerations around these 4 points. And the first thing we see is poor sleep has wide-ranging impacts, and we see this in a variety of impacts on our system. We see performance impacts negatively, we see cognitive and decision-making changes, we see affected mental health, but also more larger-reaching and holistic considerations like increased chronic disease, affected immune system, and also longevity measures like lifespan. So we see poor sleep having a broad-reaching impact, and this is based on a lot of science. And then if we look at sleep in relation to our endurance runners, we see that poor sleep will increase the risk of running injuries. And there's 3 studies that I'm going to reference that look into running injuries and the impact of sleep. And the first one was a study by Goldberg in 2025, which found that runners with poor sleep quality had an increased risk of injury, and this actually represented an early warning sign for the onset of an injury, and that maybe sleep is something we can monitor to mitigate injury risk. The second is a study by Jijong and Taras from last year, and this is an excellent study where they subclassified runners into different types of sleep based off their quality and quantity of sleep, and found that runners that had poorer sleep quality and quantity were 1.78 times more likely to report injuries than good sleepers, indicating a direct link between sleep and injury risk in this population group. And the last study was looking at adolescent runners and adolescent track and field athletes, and found that both the quantity and the quality of sleep were associated with musculoskeletal injuries in this population group. And these are only 3 of many studies indicating a link between poor sleep and increased risk of running injuries. And so, let's apply the sleep to our example runners. We have Bagus, who is inconsistently sleeping less than 7 hours per night, poor sleep routines, poor sleep hygiene. And the evidence, as mentioned, indicates that 1.78 times more likelihood of reporting injury. But also what the evidence suggests is mitigation in our running biomechanics and alterations in, decreases in our running performance. And if we compare this to Rizki, who has our consistent sleep routine, has over 8 hours sleep per night, not only is Rizki at a better reduced injury risk, but we see potent endurance performance benefits. In some studies, up to almost 9% from improved sleep routines. And we'll come back to that in a moment, but let's now talk about training or running load and injury risk. And in Australia, I'm very lucky to have access to some of the leading researchers in training load, including Tim Gabbett and others. And the evidence suggests that endurance runners will monitor training load, up to 90% of endurance runners in some capacity. And it's really important from an injury risk perspective to consider factors like increases in our training load relative to baseline, like our load spikes, or underloading endurance running athletes. And there's a few studies that I'm going to reference that make a particular point of this. The first study, which is a really important study, determined that we need to keep an eye on the longest distance that our endurance runners run. And this was a study by Fransden and colleagues from last year, which found that in particular, our long run distance compared to the longest run in the past 30 days has a particular increased risk, a particular link with injury risk. What they found with over 5,000 participants in this study is that if a runner increased their long run distance compared to their longest run in the past 30 days by 1 to 10%, there was a non-statistically significant increase. But if they increased it more than 10% compared to their longest run in the past 30 days, there was a 64% increase in injury risk. And one of the key findings from this study is that we do need to consider the long run distance when we're looking at the load profile of our endurance athletes, in particular compared to their longest run they've done in the past month. there's two other time points that are probably worth considering according to the literature. One of them is weekly load and the other is fortnightly load. And a study by Damstead found that 20% increases in our weekly load had a higher injury rate compared to less than 20% increases. So maybe the 20% is considered a threshold that we need to consider. If we look at our fortnightly load, the evidence suggests from a study by Nielsen that potentially 2-week cycles are better to monitor than 1-week cycles for our endurance athletes, and that maybe 30% is a threshold that we need to consider. And finally, the marathon is a pinnacle for a lot of our endurance runners, both recreational and sub-elite. And a study has found that there's probably a threshold for our marathon runners. And in particular, if our marathon runners run less than 30 kilometres per week compared to running more than 30 kilometres per week, their injury risk is over 100% higher. And so perhaps we need to consider, do our marathon runners need to run a minimum of 30 kilometres per week to avoid injury risk or mitigate their injury risk, is what the evidence suggests. And these are some studies which will be included in a companion guide at the end, but for those that are interested in the data like myself, these are some of the evidence-based studies that talk about load management in endurance runners. But let's now apply our training load to our two example runners. So we have Bagus, who shows an inconsistent weekly load profile. We see week 1 to 2, there's a 100% increase. And from week 3 to 4, a 66% decrease before Bagus then jumps back to his previous level of training load. If we contrast this in our weekly load to Rizki, we see a much more balanced load profile. We see progressive, 5 to 15% increases and a planned deload week, which as a side note, I'm a huge fan of planned offloading or planned deload when working with this population group. And it's also important, based off the Franston study, to consider our long run distance per week, because we know there's a direct link with that and our injury risk. And we can see, if we apply the criteria from the Franston study, there is 3 occurrences where Bagus has a load spike more than 10% compared to his previous long run in the past 30 days. And if we then look at that comparative to Rizki, we see a much more balanced profile. We see the 5 to just over 10% increases, and I mean, if we're really picky, there are 2 occurrences where Rizki is doing over that 10%, but I think most people here can likely see that it's a much more balanced load profile. And so if we compare these two between Bagus and Rizki, we see that Bagus has this inconsistent training. We have multiple occurrences of load spikes or increases in our training load, and this likely has that higher injury risk, which is evidence-based. And so then we compare that to Rizki, who has this consistent, well-planned, periodized plan. There's a deload week there. There's no big spikes. And so the evidence suggests that this sort of training increases, not only reduces our injury risk, but has direct performance benefits. And some studies say close to 9% for this sort of well-planned training. And so we can see a big difference between the two. We're now going to talk about running biomechanics and injury, and this can be quite a controversial topic online. Some people advocate that biomechanics doesn't matter, and other people will die on the hill that biomechanics is really important. And I'm just going to tell you some evidence-based considerations. And there's some really big studies that look into running biomechanics, and these will be included in the companion guide at the end. But there's the Sayson study, the Will Watcher study, the Musavi study, the Correa study, and the Lopez study, but among others. And these studies look into numerous biomechanical factors and their link with endurance running injuries. But when we break it all down, we go, what moves the needle? What is the important factors that are worthwhile considering in relation to injury risk that I think are important for coaches and those working with endurance runners? And these are some of the common technique faults that are evidence-based and linked with running injuries. And the first one is our dynamic knee valgus and our peak hip adduction or internal rotation in mid-stance, consistently linked with knee-related running injuries, among other lower limb injuries. We see our contralateral pelvic drop at mid-stance being a biomechanical factor that is linked again with running-related knee pain and hip pain. And we see a variety of trunk lean positions linked with running-related knee pain and other lower limb injuries. We also see, which is another controversial topic in the running-related literature, pronation or rear foot eversion. And again, some people advocate that it is highly important, and other people advocate that it is a normal biomechanical characteristic that we see. And what the evidence suggests that it is linked with a plethora of lower limb running injuries. And particular, clinically, I would say it's important to consider asymmetrical pronation and rapid, uncontrolled pronation, which are the ones that are typically linked with our lower limb injuries like stress fractures, medial tibial stress, running-related knee pain. We also see that overstriding or an increased knee extension at initial contact is a factor that's been linked with running-related knee pain, stress fractures, and also lower back pain in runners. And I put up heel strike on there because this is another controversial topic in the biomechanical literature, where some people advocate that we should try and change heel strike. And if you look online, a lot of the running influencers will be talking about changing heel strike. And what I would caution anyone who's considering modifying foot strike is to first understand that even in the elite level, up to 80 to 85% of runners are rear foot strikers or heel strikers. And rather than one strike being better than the other, we need to consider where is the load being put for each of these foot strikes. And what we see is for our rear foot strike, we have increased load on the knee or the patellofemoral joint, whereas our forefoot strike has increased load on the ankle, the Achilles, or the foot. And if we are to shift or change our foot strike, we're going to see an increase in load in those areas, but also an increase in incidence in those areas. So if you are considering changing foot strike, I would encourage anyone to make sure that their runner or their athlete has the requisite capacity, but also has a adequate transition period. And there's some work by Irene Davis and others that talks about making sure we have that transition period to avoid injury. And look, the evidence suggests these are a number of other factors that we don't have time to go through today that are linked with, running biomechanical factors that are linked with endurance running injuries. And there's a lot of research to back this up. So these are some of the many studies that talk about running biomechanics, endurance running injuries. So let's apply it to our two runners again. We go, Bagus has a slow cadence or step rate, has increased vertical oscillation, and a number of asymmetrical factors that are linked with injury risk. And as mentioned in the studies, there's probably a higher injury risk. But as a lot of the researchers here can probably attest to, it is very hard to pinpoint one factor being causative of injury risk, let alone one factor and putting a magnitude of risk on that one factor. But if we contrast this to Rizki's biomechanics, we see a faster cadence and other factors much more within normal limits. And the evidence suggests for Rizki, not only does he have a reduced risk of injury, but there's potentially improvements in running economy, and economy being a potent measure of our endurance running performance, and that more efficient biomechanics actually has a potential performance lens for our endurance runners. And I'm finally going to touch on strength training and injury, the last of the four considerations. And we know that the majority of runners acknowledge that strength training is important, but over 60% of endurance runners don't actually include strength training in their routines. And maybe this will help you convince them otherwise. Because we know that strength training, especially when well planned, has the potential to reduce our running injury rates. And I'm going to contrast three recent studies to just provide evidence of this point. The first one was a study by Lepinen in 2024, which found a 39% lower injury prevalence of doing a hip and core strength program compared to a control group. The next study, which I really like this study by Design colleagues, found that if runners were highly compliant with their endurance running program, there was an 85% less likelihood of sustaining a running injury. But the key factor here was the runner's compliance to the program rather than just participating itself. So the higher compliance was needed for the injury prevention benefit. And the last one is a study by Nadiri from this year, which determined that an online strength program, which I think is a great initiative potentially as a low-cost, high-value intervention, which may be appropriate for certain remote areas or individuals that have cost as a barrier, found a 45% reduction in running injuries compared to controls. And the other consideration is that strength can mitigate against performance decreases. And we see that endurance runners have their reactive and explosive strength decrease from the start to the end of the racing season or a marathon block. And so that maybe strength training can help mitigate against these. So if we apply these back to our example runners, we see that Bagus doesn't regularly strength train, and occasionally does some bodyweight exercises, which is a common profile of many of the runners I see clinically. And this not only increases the injury risk, but potentially mitigates the performance benefits that we see. If we compare this to Rizky, who has a consistent 2 times a week, 40 to 45 minute strength program, we see that there's this lower injury risk of running injuries, but also potent performance benefits. Running economy can be up to 8% better, and time trial performance up to 7.2% better, for doing strength training. And so if we look at our 2 example runners, we can see a number of holistic factors that are quite common in many of the runners we see can make a really large difference between one runner to the other. And I would encourage everyone here today to think about what can we target for runners like Bagus, which will be common for the runners that we see, to reduce injury risk and improve performance. And these are other considerations that I think, this could be a conference in itself. So I don't want people to think that the factors I've spoken about are the only important factors for endurance runners. And if we have time, I'm going to briefly just talk about how I integrate a couple of these considerations into my clinical practice. So I mentioned monitoring sleep and wellness. And for me, I'm lucky enough to use technology called Lumen Sports, which allows me to have real-time monitoring of my athletes' sleep and wellness, and allow me to modify my training and programming based off that. But not everyone has access to expensive technology like Lumen technology. And the majority of our athletes will have access to wearable technology, which can pick up our sleep data and stress data. There's validated research questionnaires like the PROMIS Sleep Disturbance Short Form. But even, I encourage any of those working with any athlete, but definitely endurance athletes, to consider regular subjective scoring out of 10 for your sleep duration, your sleep quality, and then modify your interventions based off this. I'm also lucky enough to have access to VALD technology in my clinical practice, and I'm a big believer that data drives decisions. And I also regularly conduct biomechanical gait analyses with many of the runners that I work with. And while not everyone has access to this technology, most people here will have access to a smartphone. And if you are looking to work with athletes and endurance athletes, I would encourage using at least 2 views, a frontal and a sagittal plane view. And make sure if you're going to work with these athletes and assess their biomechanics, that you slow down the footage, because we know working in real time, you miss a lot of the biomechanical factors. So slow motion is really important. There's increasing AI technology, wearable technology, and even some video programs that are out there. And finally, I put up a couple of research ideas. There's people in Indonesia that will have much deeper understanding of the evidence than I do, but from my brief overview, there appears to be a gap in the running injury and participation data, and opportunities for low-cost or value-based interventions. And I think collaborative opportunities between countries like Australia and Indonesia are great opportunities, and education, technology, and looking at the influence of things like social media. And so I always like to finish with a couple of key messages, and the first one is hopefully you can see the way that I practice and believe is that proactive and holistic management is much more important than reactive management. But I like to finish with a positive message, and this one is that running, by a study from Lee and colleagues, is that running is a potent longevity measure and has up to a 40% reduction in the risk of premature death. So I think that's a really cool statistic. And I mentioned that I put together a resource guide, so for those that are interested, they can access it via this QR code. It has all the recommended readings, it has further depth of information based off the presentation today. It also has access to a 1-hour webinar that I've recorded for participants on running biomechanics. It's also available on my website, so take a photo of that so you can access it later. Thank you for listening, Terima kasih, and I hope you got something out of it.
Wow, that was a very meaningful and insightful presentation by Dr. Kai Wei. Now, before we move on to the next keynote